Right. Okay. So I'll just launch straight into it then. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. Sorry I wasn't here earlier. I was making nest boxes with children at Stroud Community Agriculture. Okay. So conservation in crisis, a historical context. I can't move. We've all heard about that England is now one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And that quote actually was from the DEFRA consultation on land use that came out on January the 31st. So even the government has now recognised it. We talk about declines in birds, loss of woodland, uh, butterflies, these very depressing sort of statistics all around us. So my question is, how did we end up here? How did we get here? So after the last ice age, most of this country was a mosaic of woodlands, marshlands, and open pasture. The last remaining habitat similar to this was probably the Białowieski forest in Poland and some of the Caledonian forests in upland areas. The early post-glacial hunter-gatherers would have had a local impact on perhaps on some of the larger mammals and began to clear land. Early farmers cleared land and began to protect their stock from predators. So large predators became, rather than something to get fur from, they became a threat to livestock. Further intensification through the Bronze Age and Iron Age, particularly during the Roman period, occurred. There was vast amounts of farming, particularly farming for both crops and also hay to provide food for horses in the Roman period. Large parts of Gloucestershire, I think it's evidence from agricultural archaeological digs were used for farming, particularly for horses for various garrisons. This led to the big decline in large mammals across large parts of the UK. We no longer had bears or bison. The last wolf probably went in probably about 1200. The Saxon open field system between areas of woodlands and common grazing was an interesting area, and these were probably important areas for a whole range of birds. In fact, many open ground species like lapwing and possibly curlew and skylarks probably really benefited from the open field system because you have to remember that prior to this being mostly woodland or woodland glade, it's probably a very different ecological fauna. But even today in this country, about 2/3 of our birds and at least half of our butterflies and a vast majority of our invertebrates are actually, and virtually all our mammal species, with the exception of things like hares, which have been introduced, are actually woodland species. Much of our natural fauna was a woodland or woodland edge species, possibly in some of the open grazing areas, the bison, but it was certainly very, very different to what we have today. The Norman conquest changed much of the way the land was managed there. The picture on the right of the map of England there shows the royal forests, and these were native broadleaf woodlands that were largely retained for hunting by the kings. This was a dramatic change from the Saxon forest law, whereas in Saxon forest law, there's a whole range of benefits for local people collecting wood, sometimes taking game, certainly grazing their pigs and animals in these forests. Normans had a completely different approach. They basically banned people from their forests and even collecting wood, pain of death for felling trees or killing deer. Now, this was absolutely brutal for the local populations, and it's why the Saxons really hated the Normans in many ways, but it was brilliant for wildlife. Except for the few deer and boar that were hunted, which was relatively few in compared to the total population, it was probably really good for wildlife and retained much of our woodland flora and fauna. Now, this began to break down with various kings, although many of the kings following the monarchs following Henry William I continued with this brutal sort of forest law. Richard the Lionheart, they're fighting somebody in the Middle East, spent most of his time in France and on crusades. And to fund his desire for religious salvation, he actually had to sell off large parts of his ownership, his land. Large parts of the woodlands in southern England were sold to fund his crusades for religious salvation or whatever he wanted, or to retain his land in France. He actually only spent 6 months in this country. Much of that was actually turned into farmland rather than retain this management practice of woodland and farmland. The picture in the middle of there is the War of the Roses. It's called the War of the Roses, but that's a nice way of calling it. It's basically a civil war between various families. And because so many people were fighting and different factions were fighting, there was actually quite a breakdown of forest law. And while peasants, took firewood and deer, the merchant classes started taking timber for their houses and also for timber for selling. And really interestingly, filling large areas of woodland in the native woodlands for timber, people realized that deer were coming in and started grazing the young shoots. So it's actually the first silviculture legislation was in 1843, just before the Battle of Bosworth and the end of the War of the Roses, where people were fencing bits of woodland to actually allow it to grow up so that the deer didn't graze it, so it did actually regenerate. But it was fairly anarchistic, so there was a breakdown of that. But perhaps one of the biggest changes was the fact that Catherine of Aragon, or possibly due to Henry VIII, couldn't father an heir, and the breakdown or the sell-off of the monasteries, the dissolution of the monasteries, had a dramatic effect. The monasteries had actually grown rich and powerful on their close association of the management of farmland and woodland, like it is over much of parts of Europe. And one of the reasons why Europe still retains a lot of native woodland is because this close association between farmland management and woodland management, silviculture management. But this began to break down. And with the breakup and disillusionment of the monasteries, much of this land was sold off. And it was sold off in blocks. And people then began to, there was a breakdown in the link between woodland management and farming, and a lot of it was sold off. And at the time we moved into the Tudor period, sheep farming was becoming very important, so the trees just weren't replanted, so there was a massive loss in our woodland there. Then of course the other big change in the English landscape was the enclosures. Now enclosures started way back in the 12th century with some of the open field systems being enclosed. Now, this probably led to quite a dramatic change in the wildlife in our countryside. The rise of the enclosure, particularly during the Tudor period, was for sheep farming. And this enclosures reached a peak in the 18th and 19th century, when it was acts of parliament rather than just landlords or large landowners just purloining the open grazing from the peasants. And so there's parliamentary acts of enclosure. And these led to, between 1604 and 1914, there were over 5,000 enclosure bills, which amounted to enclosing over nearly 3 million hectares of open fields. So we went in that period from an open field system which had been great for skylarks and open ground species, to the quintessential English landscape. And it probably led to the rise in many species. Woodland edge butterflies were in the hedgerows, and large numbers of farmland birds that were really important. Combined with this, at the same time as this was happening, there was the first agricultural revolution. There was Viscount Townshend at the top there, who became nicknamed as Turnip Townshend because of the introduction of the Norfolk 4-year rotation, which was wheat, turnips, barley, and clover. And the turnips gave the soil a rest, and clover provided nitrogen to regenerate to actually have you could actually have the best what became known as first wheats, which was the best wheats after clover had put the nitrogen back in the ground. Jethro Tull in the bottom corner there was the inventor of the seed drill. And this dramatically changed the efficiency of agriculture there, that we could actually have seeds can be sown in rows for the very first time. Previous to that, the land was tilled and it was just broadcast all over it, which would have actually been brilliant for birds. Birds following somebody broadcasting seed would have picked all sorts of things up. And it would have been great. And then Robert Bakewell, at the bottom corner there, slightly chubby chap with a hat on, he developed the first sort of selective breeding of animals, and that led to a much more intensification of farm livestock production, particularly sheep, and that were linked to the enclosures that actually dramatically changed the English countryside from the open field system to this enclosed farm landscape that we see pictured there, of these small fields and hedgerows and trees, which probably was very, very good because there was no artificial fertilizers, there was no pesticides. So butterflies would have thrived. There would have been wildflowers in the edges. There was no herbicides. So it was actually probably a pretty biodiverse and wildlife-rich countryside. But it was also quite productive because he had to feed the people. I thought it was great for some species, like the yellowhammer probably really benefited from the enclosures. Skylarks probably declined with the enclosure of fields. And again, it was absolutely brutal for the rural poor because, again, they were kicked off the land, and many of them had to go into poorhouses, and many of them ended up being forced into the cities and towns and work in the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. It was one of the biggest changes in the English landscape done by Parliamentary Act, forcing people off the land. The complaints of farmers today with inheritance tax were nothing to their forebears when they were forced off the land. Obviously, the development of originally much of the land would have been cultivated by horse. Horsepower was the major motive force in this country before the development of steam, and combustion engines and tractors. And you have to remember that huge areas of England were actually set aside for growing hay for horses and also oats for horses and various feed. So it would have been a very different landscape. I mean, it's thought that the massive loss in grasslands since about 1900. Yes, it's driven by increased agricultural production, but one of the key drivers was the fact that we didn't need to grow grass to provide the energy for horses. And so it's not surprising today that we see farmers putting some of their land under solar to generate energy, because, I mean, the area of land under solar is far less than it ever was for grass, providing the energy for horses, and it probably never will be. So possibly 1% of our arable agricultural land will go under solar by 2050. It won't be a huge, whereas up to 60% of our land was grasslands, for feeding cattle and sheep, but also as the major source of food for horses. At the outbreak of World War I, well, first of all, remember that plants need nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, water, and sunlight. And from the earliest days in agriculture, farmers discovered various ways to prevent crop yields declining to restoring nitrogen to the soil through manures and cover crops. But it's really worth noting that the outbreak of World War One, the Allied powers controlled the deposits of sodium nitrate and guano in Chile, Peru, and India. Both important as a fertilizer, but perhaps more important that sodium nitrate was an essential part for explosives. And without a source of nitrate and ammonia, the German army would have capitulated within months. But Fritz Haber there, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, the two people at the bottom of that slide, developed an efficient way to produce ammonia on an industrial scale. First for the manufacture of explosives to keep the First World War going, but more importantly, producing cheap nitrogen for feeding the world. It was actually a really important source of nitrogen. And today, a third of the global food production is through ammonia produced by the Haber-Bosch process, and it's responsible for feeding at least half the world. So the pressures of producing an industrial scale ammonia to produce bombs in the First World War has led to fertilizers, modern artificial fertilizers. Now, these are great for growing vigorous crops, but terrible for many insects and birds and bats that rely on the flowering plants to get out competed by these more vigorous crops and that bright green field there, which, as Tim was talking about, they're probably emitting, I know, 3 tons of carbon per hectare or something like that. I mean, a few species have benefited from, wildlife has benefited from changes in the use of fertilizer, particularly wood pigeon and deer. So we have to think that, you know, had somebody, the First World War not started, we don't know what happened. Of course, by 1937, you have to remember Britain was a superpower. It had the empire. And as a trading nation, it thought it could buy all the food it needed. In fact, over 2/3 of the food eaten in Britain by 1937 were actually imported. 98% of onions, 76% of cheese, 88% of flour, 82% of sugar, and 55% of meat and 40% of eggs came from abroad in 1937. We were basically, the country was just buying food from its empire. Now, at the outbreak of war, if the population in Britain was very, very well fed, but as you see in the bottom picture there, the Nazi submarines began to take out the supply ships across the Atlantic, and had the Nazi Germany succeeded in sinking all the supply ships, much of the population of Britain would have starved, and Britain would probably have capitulated and lost the Second World War. Now, the government realized that they were in a real problem in 1939, and they actually devised a plan to pay farmers £2 per acre to plough up pasture and convert land to cultivated land. And as you see in the slide there, the actual output between 1939 and 1942 of wheat and barley rose by about 2/3, oats by 3/4, and the tonnage of potatoes doubled. Although there was a massive change in agriculture during the Second World War, we still had rationing until the 1950s. After the Second World War, the 1947 Agriculture Act was specifically designed to increase production. And it did this by securing farmer incomes via guaranteed produce prices. They would get a guaranteed price, improved farmer tenancy security, implementing high farmers' understanding, and also councils were given the power to acquire by agreement or compulsory purchase of land. As you see from the graph there was a massive increase in the yield of food, particularly wheat, across this country. And this was because of the fear of starvation that people now forget that Britain was on the brink of losing the Second World War and starving. So the changes were driven by politics and the politics of fear of starvation. This was disastrous for wildlife across this country. We had pesticides being developed, fertilizers, drainage of our wetlands. We lost 90% of our wetlands between 1900 and 1990s. About half the hedgerows were removed. And of course, many of the pesticides used to start with were very persistent pesticides like DDT and dieldrin and aldrin, and they've had long-lasting effects. Aldrin and dieldrin were introduced in 1957 as a sheep dip and a seed dressing to prevent various pests, and that was the chemicals along with DDT that led to the decline in birds of prey and also species like the otter. And the otter has just returned to Sussex, having been died out as a result of aldrin poisoning or affecting its breeding success in the 1950s. It's taken over, 80 years, 70 years, sorry, 75 years to recover from the improvements in the outcomes. So there's been some dramatic changes. And then, of course, there's the no longer was the agricultural policy determined by the barons and the big landowners or the monarch. It became to do with policy. The EU and the Common Agricultural Policy was again designed to ensure that never again would there be starvation in Europe, and it was largely successful at that. But it led to the notorious butter mountains and wine lakes, and a dramatic industrialization of farming and overproduction. And particularly the way it was implemented in different countries was very different. In this country, we had headage payments, the number of sheep, particularly in the uplands, which led to the massive overgrazing of the uplands and the decline in many of upland birds, insects, and mammals. And perhaps one for lowland farming, one of the biggest changes that affected our wildlife was the use of winter wheat and multi-cut silage. Winter wheat meant that the wheat and barley to an extent and oats was sown in the autumn, and so it was a green cover crop, which is great for growing, but it meant there was no stubble, so there was no winter food, and also the fact that it came up so early that many of the open bird species, the grasses were so enclosed that there was nowhere to nest, and also the average winter wheat crop in this country probably has 10 doses of agrochemicals between October and harvest the following July. So there's quite a dramatic effect. Multi-cut silage was much of the of England. When people look out and they see these bright green, this green and pleasant land, a lot of it is intensive ryegrass grown principally to feed cattle, and with perhaps 6 cuts of between 3 and 6 cuts of silage, maybe 6 is probably pushing it, but 4 means that each time birds try and nest in there, the silage cutter comes along, takes out their nest, and kills the birds. Species like the skylark have declined really dramatically, even on the big field systems, because of silage. Very few flowers, useless for insects, and it's probably the most least biodiverse land you can have. A couple of years ago, my wife and I walked the Cotswold Way, and it was really noticeable hearing the birds singing on the commons and things. But when you came down into the intensive grasslands of parts of the Severn Vale, there was virtually nothing. But the times, they are a-changing. Perhaps not as early as Bob Dylan wanted them to, but they are changing. Organic and biodynamic farming and agroforestry. Oh, I've just written agro there. Okay. Are coming in. Organic farming system is producing use of natural processes. Much of the farming in this country since the early Stone Age would have met the criteria for organic. And the term organic was coined by Lord Northbourne in his book Look to the Land in 1940. But the movement actually has a lot to do with the theory of the biodynamic agriculture of Rudolf Steiner. And the work of Yves Balfour, who, with the formation of the Soil Association in 1946. There was very little government support for it. Biodynamic standards were developed independently, and there are now 9 organic certification systems. Organic farming, be it small scale horticulture or large scale wheat production, minimum use of pesticides, or there are some, and herbicides. And it does mean that there is much more invertebrate fauna, and therefore all the studies have shown that there is actually an increase in wildlife on organic farms. So organic farming is an opportunity to for wildlife to begin to recover. Although it's not the whole answer, but it does mean that there is a chance for various species to begin to come back and live in a farm landscape. Clearly, the actual level of food production on an organic farm is generally lower than a highly fertilized farm, but uh, that is the balance is that the price paid is higher. But only about 3% of farming in the UK is organic. And whilst organic sales are increasing in the UK, they had a peak during COVID, dropped again, but are increasing again. Most of it is imported. The government has not had any particularly good incentive. There is an organic conversion schemes, and there are various agri-environment schemes, but they're not actually promoting organic farming like much of the continent is done. Large areas of under the EU regulations, large areas of continental Europe have very good organic farming supported by the government. And we will see whether in our post-Brexit nirvana, or whatever we want to call it, under the higher tiers of alms, that we'll actually have more organic farming. But not all wildlife-friendly farming is organic. There are numerous schemes, and I'll give you a list at the end of some of them. Fair to Nature is one being promoted by the RSPB. And their farmers are sign up, and there's various standards that they can go to, and they're actually advised how to use the various agri-environment schemes to the optimum to wildlife. Leaf is another one there that is well-known non-organic certification schemes linking wildlife farming. And so some farmers joining these schemes can actually have reasonably good wildlife populations, and some of them have really good wildlife populations. And gradually, we are seeing changes, as was talked about by Tim and various other people, in the agricultural support schemes. Public money for public goods is the mantra of our friend Mr. Gove when he was in government. And there are numerous schemes there. I don't think I've got them all there. The last two classed there is Wales and Agri-Environment Climate Schemes. There's a Scottish one, but it's changing all the while. And I think most farmers and landowners recognise that the governments have good intention, but are poor on delivery. And if you talk to any farmer about this, they always say it's fiendishly difficult to navigate. And it's been great for consultants and great for organisations, really good for organisations like FWAG and the farm advisors, can actually allow farmers to actually introduce them. I mean, some of them are actually quite interesting in that where you've got landscape recovery, and I think Tim talked about that, where you actually get linkages of farms together to produce wildlife friendly farming over a much bigger area. These are probably really beneficial. And then we've got regenerative farming. Now this is a really interesting one. Regenerative farming covers a whole range of things. It generally includes no-till, cover cropping, diversity of rotations, and integration of livestock into the farming systems. And the aim is the recognition is that, we probably only have, how many harvests left? 60 harvests left, probably 55 now, because we've degraded our soil, and it's about regenerating the soil. Now, it's come about at an interesting time, and there is no standard for regenerative farming. And people say they're regenerative farming, and some of them are doing it for a much deeper way, with perhaps some mob grazing if they've got cattle, and herbal lays, retaining stubble. One of the drivers, obviously, has been the price of oil and the price of fertilizers. And many farmers, particularly in East Anglia, have gone for no-till purely on a fuel-saving drive, and also the cost of fertilizer. I mean, I was talking to one of the big Gloucestershire farmers probably about 3 years ago, and he was saying that he was really pleased that they'd retained some of their cattle. They're a big, mainly arable farmer, but he likes cattle, and they ran cattle on some of their poorer land, and they're really pleased that they kept their cattle because the cattle muck was a problem. But now it was as an opportunity. They're actually cleaning down the yards and mixing up the cattle with liquid and using it as liquid fertilizer, adding organic material back into his fields rather than fossil fuel fertilizer. And he said he was actually getting some better crops than he had. So financial drivers, but also many farmers, you talk to them and they say it's sort of it's feeling that they're going back to there's something regenerative. They like it, and it's a feeling in heart and soul, just more than growing a crop as a business. They're actually beginning to connect with the soil. Farmers have been giving a hard time for destroying wildlife, and they're very, very defensive. So that it is something that many farmers begin to believe in. But much of regenerative farming can't happen without glyphosate. It's used to kill off the crops before the no-tilling and the next crop being seeded. I mean, glyphosate was developed in the 1970s as a more benevolent alternative to atrazine, which was banned in Europe, or banned since 2004. The global use of glyphosate has increased significantly since the 1990s, and it's used all over the world. It does break down when it hits the soil, but it also gets it can get into watercourses, and they're increasing evidence of it getting into foodstuffs. So it's a real balancing act there. There are some farms that are actually now practicing regenerative farming, no-till, no glyphosate. Bradwell Estates, which is just into Oxfordshire, I think. No, is it still in Gloucestershire? By Burford there. They are developing no-till, no glyphosate organic farming, where they're actually using mechanical weeding with high-tech cameras between the rows of wheat to actually take out any weeds. And that's really interesting. So high-tech farming with AI to identify whether it's a weed plant or a wheat plant actually may becoming really important in the reduced use of glyphosate. But obviously, George Monbiot has really lashed out against regenerative farming because many farmers, particularly in North America, are claiming that their farming is regenerative, putting large numbers of cattle out on their pasture and claiming that their grasslands are carbon neutral. And there is actually a big ideological battle with regenerative farming. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but it's really interesting to see where it's going. So it's a financial and various other drivers there. So has any of these changes began to turn the tide on our wildlife? Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. This is Hope Farm, bought by the RSPB, run under their nature-friendly farming. They have contract farmers on it, and it's a commercial farm, makes a profit. It's not organic. But since they took it over in 2000, the number of farmland birds has increased dramatically. And they're basically using its hedgerow management, different hedgerow management techniques, grass strips around the edge, careful use of herbicides so it doesn't go into the grass strips, and a whole range of other schemes, and they've shown quite a dramatic increase in various invertebrates and butterflies. So that it is working. It does require a bit of thinking and guidance and a change in a mindset, but it can be done. And also perhaps this is Allerton Farm. This is run by a different organisation with different drivers, the Game Conservancy Trust, who are there to support farmers for shooting and game management. But they've actually shown that on their Allerton farm that they've actually had a massive increase in songbird numbers, an increase in brown hare, and also for the shooting community, a big increase in in partridge numbers, and shown that they can have wildlife-friendly farming, game shooting, whatever you think of that, and still make a profit out of their farm. Again, they're using all the agri-environment schemes to that optimum, getting good advice. So there are ways of farming that are good for wildlife. And of course, you can't talk about farming and wildlife without talking about rewilding. There are numerous schemes. I've just mentioned two very briefly. NEP, everybody knows about NEP, the big on clay wheat farming that was having great difficulty farming many of their land. They didn't make any money. They've seen dramatic increases with a dramatic increase in many species of things like the nightingale is one it's known iconically for, the rise in emperor butterflies, and the retention and increase in turtle doves are just some of the few. They're farming in a very different way. They're effectively ranching cattle, deer, Tamworth pigs, and they make their money from the agri-environment schemes, the glamping, the tours, and their high quality beef, venison, and pork, which they sell at a premium. The other one on the other side there is Pickering Wildwoods in the Scottish borders, and this was an intensively grazed sheep farm where I actually did my PhD on wild goats back in the 70s, and it was like that sort of very bare area there. It was bought by a conservation organisation, and they have then they moved all the sheep out of it and have begun to plant and let it rewild. There they've seen a massive change in the woodland species and invertebrates and flowering plants. And it's one of the best examples, in my opinion, of a large area. They've actually just bought an area beyond the Raven Craig there at the back there, and some more land before. They're running it as a trust. It's not as a commercial farm, because those sheep farms only made money, only broke even because of the headage payments. In this valley, they were all ran Cheviots. Some of the other ones they did make money using blackface sheep, because they were better. So, reflections. How have we become one of the most nature depleted countries, and is it possible to return? On that image there, I put a yellowhammer, because the yellowhammer probably symbolizes many of the changes that have happened. This is a woodland edge species, a hedgerow species. Obviously, the early farmers and the use of the land changed from the wildwoods to the open farming systems, which were probably bad for yellowhammers. But in terms, we still had quite a lot of wildlife. The enclosures were a dramatic change in the farming landscape, and probably really beneficial for wildlife, but bad for people. Clearly, if Richard the Lionheart hadn't been quite as obsessed with his religious salvation in returning Jerusalem to the Catholic faith rather than from Saladin, we might have had more woodland in southern England. And obviously, if Catherine Aragon and Henry VIII had a male heir, his first wife, we probably wouldn't have left the Catholic Church, and we probably would have a lot more woodland still, because the monasteries would not have been have changed. There's obviously changes and quirks during the First World War, the development of the Haber-Bosch process, and also the pressure for food, and possibly the in this country, one of the reasons why we've got such a force wildlife is because we're such a trading nation. Prior to the Second World War, we had this massive empire that we imported all this food that led to such a dramatic change in the agricultural systems since the 1947 Act, and where it was food, by all means possible, which led to the, as I talked about earlier, 90% loss in wetlands, 90% loss in grasslands, and this complete change of the British landscape to produce food. But bizarrely, we're about self-sufficient in wheat. We produce about 70% of our foodstuff. We're self-sufficient. We could be self-sufficient in beef, but we export quite a lot of it and import lots. But the one area of food production that we're not self-sufficient in, and and we import about 60 or 70%, is vegetables and fruit, and that's of the types that we could grow in this country. One of the dramatic or failures, in my opinion, of the government is this lack of support to the horticultural industry, in that we could be actually possibly producing 60, 70, 8%, 80% of the vegetables that we need, and we could be producing virtually all our salads and tomatoes in this country, but there is not the support systems for it. And it's strange to reflect that that also that we've got the possibly, you know, the some of the newspapers are maybe at fault for this, and popularist politicians, in that we have to remember that in 1950 the average household spent 30% of their income on food shopping. In 1974 this was down to about 20%, and today even the poorest families probably only spend 10 to 12% of their income on food. Food in this country has become much, much cheaper, and this has probably been at the cost to wildlife, and as Tim was talking about earlier, probably at the cost to massive carbon emissions in this country. And just for the talk at the end, that's a few of the organisations who are helping with the change to more wildlife-friendly farming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was really interesting, and I particularly liked hearing about the history of it all and putting it into context. If anybody has any questions for Simon, we've got a couple of minutes. Please do put them in the chat, or if you would like to ask Simon something directly or have any comments, then please raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can speak to him. I'll just double check. I think I've got one question here from Yolande. And she has said, what do you see as the upcoming policies / discussions that are missing the input of farmers?
Blimey, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the key really is that in terms of UK policy, it really needs to make that farmers will basically respond to whatever economic drivers there are, landowners, but they're also tradition. So I think policies developed by people in sharp suits sitting at desks in Whitehall is not always very helpful. I think the key policy changes will be to actually have a relatively simple form of agri-environment schemes that do benefit wildlife, and whether we like it or not, probably do benefit some of the game shooting interest, because farmers have, or many landowners, whatever you think about it, and I don't think shooting is a very good idea, but from a purely wildlife point of view, some of those are quite important. And it is this joining up and also consistency over a number of years. It takes a landowner, you know, several years. It's 2 years in conversion into organic, or probably 3. But if you're going to change, it means you're investing in different kit and things like this. So what people want is a guaranteed future for the types of farming that they're going to take forward, and not this continual bashing. And farmers who are farming in a wildlife friendly way, and organisations, they need to be bigged up and really supported, because the things are different, and there are opportunities. And also, to be quite honest, one of the bizarre things is that I know we've got inheritance tax is a big issue, but also some of the taxes on farmers with land transfer, particularly say for woodlands, If they're being managed purely for conservation, you have to pay tax on them, handing on to the next generation. But if they're being managed as a commercial forestry, you don't. So there could be some changes in the tax system to allow farmers to manage their land in an environmentally friendly way, and then be able to pass it on to their next generation continuously, rather than having to decide to chop off of it down to actually manage the tax system. Because there's some very odd things there. There's this bit of a mishmash and lack of coordination. The opportunity for the land use consultation, which I thought was a bit sort of flaky, to be quite honest. But that in many ways is an opportunity, but it shouldn't be saying you've got to have 10% of your land for this, that, and the other. You need to provide the incentives and the way forward. I mean, some of the big battles that are going to come potentially is that, are people going to get paid for carbon sequestration? And the role of things like biodiversity net gain. Is that going to work? How is it going to work? What are the opportunities there?
Thank you, Simon. We've had a question from Stella, who's asked, how do we get more young people to go into horticulture as a career?
Cheap housing in the countryside is the biggest block to young people wanting to go into farming and horticulture, unless you've got somewhere, because it doesn't pay particularly high rates, unless you're lucky that you've got parents who've got a farm or have got access to a farm. It's really difficult to get into farming. Lots of young people want to get into farming, and lots of people want to get into horticulture, but the biggest block is the cost of living in the countryside. And if there was an opportunity for low cost housing being built in the countryside, in the area of outstanding natural beauty, that could be rented at a reasonable rate, it would completely transform the opportunities. And that's the big issue in Stroud, in the Stroud district, where we are. Where I am, some of the people might on this call may be miles away, and if I was at Hawkwood, I'd just point out the window at about 4 different local community or local small horticultural operations, and the biggest difficulty they have in retaining staff or keeping staff is the cost of housing.
Thank you. And we have a question from Charlie R, who said when you were speaking earlier that it's frustrating when listening to some of the scientific results, because there are also those out there that show more carbon sequestration can take place. Who does one believe / listen to?
That's a really difficult question. Basically, if you think about the basics, is that the science on carbon sequestration, I could have talked about that endlessly, because before I retired from electricity, I worked on various projects to do with carbon sequestration and what's called the carbon bank, and we had this very complex model on how what soils would work for planting deciduous trees to be carbon sequestration and would actually make money selling carbon credits. It's not straightforward, but it can be done. Each time you disturb the soil, you disturb the fungal systems and you disturb bacteria, and there will be a release of various greenhouse gases. So minimizing soil disturbance is a good start. Or if you are going to disturb the soil, only do the surface and don't do deep. So that's quite important. I think the stuff around animals is a really complex one, and it really depends, in my experience, actually to do with the soil depth and how much organic matter is there and how much organic matter is being put back in. And buying, if you're thinking of yourself as a consumer or even a producer, generally, yes, disturb the soil less. Organic tends to be of a lower greenhouse gas emissions. The issue with glyphosate is a really, really difficult one because it is quite an effective way of having no-till farming, and there are arguments on both sides. So it's an emerging area, but you can tell the really bad farms and the really good farms if you use 10 or 12 doses of agrochemicals, graze to the edge of the cultivate right to the edge of the fields, cultivate in the autumn so all the soil runs off. And they're using a high input, that will be a high carbon emission farm. Similarly, with an intensive livestock system where you're growing or even importing fish meal or soya to feed your cattle, that will be a high carbon emission. Going to the other end, lower intensity, but you can still make money out of some of these low intensity farms if you've got the right market, and you're missing out the retailers, because one of the things you have to remember is that I think of all the turnover of farming, I think only 8% of the turnover of food production in this country actually goes back to the farmers. Most of it is in the food processors and the retailers, and it is the supermarkets that are actually squeezing the profits out of many of the landowners. And with a different regime, and if any government was strong enough to actually sort of force supermarkets to give higher guaranteed prices to farmers, we would have lower carbon farming and more wildlife friendly carbon, and food prices wouldn't go up that much. It's just that the profits of the supermarkets would go down.
Mm. Oh, Fred has raised his hand. Fred, have you got a question? Let's just see if you're unmuted. There we go.
Hello. So yeah, I'm sort of wearing a couple of hats here today because I'm the climate action lead for the Cotswolds. But I do also work within soils on a landscape recovery project in Devon and other things like that. But I was interested in this because I think working for protected landscape and having a role like climate action lead entails that you need to talk about land use change in a set landscape where people have a very set vision of it, an idea of what it needs to be. It's designated as such, but in my view, landscapes have always changed. What you've demonstrated today is that it's changed over time, and that's been influenced by it back in a long time period in time. It's climate, it's forces beyond our control. But in the last 2,000 years, it's very much been human-led, and it's been a consequence of varying changes in technology and what have you. But we stand at a point now where, in my view, the greatest challenge to our landscapes is climate, or the impact of climate change. But we are having this really quite difficult conversation about how do we manage change in our landscapes. And yeah, the land use consultation is an interesting part of that. I suppose it's not so much a question, but I do think the historical context in having that discussion is very important, because I think people perceive landscapes as something that's set in stone, set in time, but really landscapes are something that always change. And we need to understand the historical context in order to look forward as to why landscapes need to change in the future. But I think it's a real opportunity through having that discussion to sort of empower people to say, well, landscapes are changing. Landscapes could change much for the worse and beyond our control if we don't limit climate change or try and build adaptation resilience to it. But also it's an opportunity for us to manage change in a positive way, whether it be for biodiversity, climate, or other ecosystem services. But yeah, I found that really interesting, not least because I did a history undergrad before mistakenly going into doing conservation. So yeah, from a nerdy point of view, that was great.
Great, thank you very much for the compliment. Yes, I mean, you look at the Cotswold Hills and look at the state of the Stroud Valleys, all these woodlands. Most of the commons and many of the sides of the hills were before the Second World War were open grassland.
Yeah.
And Robborough Common was full of pigs grazing. 100 years ago, it was very, very different.
Yeah, of course, it's changed a lot, but it's an interesting one. I mean, yeah, I couldn't sort of say that I want the landscape to change dramatically, but we are designated from a view of the landscape in, I can't remember the top of my head, but I want to say 1964 it's designated, but that forces us to hold our view of the landscape when it was in 1964. But I think that's actually a big hindrance to making positive change in many ways, because it's not a museum, it's a landscape that changes with time.
Yes, we don't want the Cotswolds kept in aspic or this bright green grass. It offends me enormously.
Yeah, but yeah, no, sorry, that was all I had to say.
Great. Okay.